In this video, I do a comparison between Oathsworn Into the Deep Woods with Kingdom Death Monster. Which one is the better game? Stay tuned and find out. But before we get into today's video, I just want to share with you what the GGGGs are for this month. Each month, Bob the Beholder picks some of my Patreon supporters to receive gratitude gifts. And for this month of September of 2022, we have these Archon Studios Pathfinder terrain, this painted City of Absalom set, and two other sets that are going to go to 3 different Patreon supporters. Also, we're going to have $100 go towards a crowdfunding campaign, which the Patreon supporters are currently voting upon. If you're interested in getting in on that, go ahead and use the link below to go to my Patreon page, and you can find out more information. This video is split up into 3 different sections. Most of it is going to be the review and comparison. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about all of the various 3D printed aids as well as terrain that I made for this game. And then finally, I'm going to have a short section about the undercoating that I use on my miniatures as I've painted them up to give them that grimdark feel. Use the timestamps below if you're interested in skipping ahead to any of those sections. Kingdom Death Monster really created a whole different genre of games called boss battlers, where you have 2 different phases. One is sort of a town phase where you're upkeeping your survivors and heroes, as well as crafting and various different narrative things that happen within your town phase. And then you have the encounter phase where you're fighting a boss rather than a bunch of individual minions. You are fighting one boss that has a fairly complex AI deck. I didn't kickstart that campaign, but I was able to get my hands on a very early copy once it started shipping. And that is one of our game group's most favorite games, especially a campaign game that can last half of a year. So Oathsworn from Shadowborn Games was a Kickstarter back in the summer of 2019, and it just delivered in 2022. So it was a 3-year delay. A lot of that was during COVID. And in terms of the games that I've been looking forward to, this is one of the top games that I really wanted to get my hands on and try out. It received a lot of good reviews. It raised about $2 million in that original campaign, and it's going to have a second Kickstarter follow-up in October, I think the 18th. So use links below if you want to sign up to be notified once that game goes through the second Kickstarter. And I predict it's going to raise millions of dollars. One of the things too that I was wondering about is Oathsworn going to be a KDM killer? In other words, was Oathsworn going to be better than KDM to the point where I can sell off all of my KDM stuff and just stick with Oathsworn? So I apologize for those of you who don't know much about KDM, but as a way for me to do this review, I'm just going to compare the 2 different games and how Oathsworn is better or inferior to that game. And if you have both, is it different enough between the 2 where you're keeping both of them, or really does Oathsworn replace KDM or vice versa? I want to start off by talking about the price. And so Oathsworn, at least in the original Kickstarter, I went in on the mid-tier $179 set, which didn't include the 3D terrain, nor did it include the armory, which is what enables you to swap out the weapons on your miniatures. Instead, I basically got the set that enables you to have miniatures versus the standees. There is a cheaper version where you can get standees instead of miniatures, and that includes the 20 bosses that you get. Those are also standees. So it's a much cheaper version, as well as a version that can fit in a smaller box. Because right now with all of the miniatures, you're getting 3 huge boxes of content. And for those of you who don't have that much shelf space, the standee version might be better for you. Kingdom Death Monster, on the other hand, was $300. I saw it selling on the secondhand market for $400. So it is a much more expensive game. And that's not including all of the different expansions that you can get for KDM, which starts off, like for one boss expansion, to be about $75, maybe even $100. So KDM is a boutique, very expensive game that many people cannot afford. So right off the bat, I think Oathsworn is actually cheaper to get into. and isn't quite as boutique as KDM. Another big difference is the theme. When I first got KDM, and it's still true today, it has one of the most unique settings that you're not entirely sure what is going on. It's sort of this nightmarish, some people even think it might be hell, not in the Dante's Inferno kind of hell, but just this really grim, mysterious, strange space. That theme is one of the most unique themes that I've ever seen and continue to ever have seen, that it has not been recreated in any other context. Most games are fantasy setting, and Oathsworn is more the traditional fantasy context, and with the grimdark overlay, as the setting isn't this high fantasy, really bright, happy place, but instead is really a hostile environment where it's actually the woods that are scary and encroaching upon civilization. Think about the movie Annihilation with Natalie Portman, which I thought was a great horror movie, where just nature is warped and twisted into something that is malevolent and might destroy you. So that's really the setting within Oathsworn. And the other thing that I have to say is some people have been put off by KDM's sort of NC-17 rating, where you do see frontal nudity in the booklets, and a lot of people complain about the sexualization of the miniatures in the game. For me, that isn't that big of a deal, but I know for others, especially if you're playing with children, that has prevented you from getting into KDM. But in Oathsworn, you don't get any nudity or anything risque like that, and even the female characters are appropriately armored up. And so this is a much more kid-friendly game, I would say PG game, other than the really grim, dark nature of the woods. So that might be a consideration for you. Also physically, like I mentioned before, the miniatures are similar to KDM, where you can build miniatures to be WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, where the armor sets, the weapons, it's a huge amount of variability where you can build miniatures that really match all of the armor and the weapons that you have. Now there's too many for my sake, and I've only built a sampling of the different armor sets where they don't have to be exactly the armor that you get, because you're constantly swapping out armor. But for those of you who really like that kind, actually KDM is going to have more specific options for you in kitting out your miniatures. Oathsworn also does that if you buy the optional armor pack, where it isn't so much the armor that's variable, but the weapons. So the arms is really what you're swapping out. And in all honesty, I glued all of my miniatures together because I didn't want the miniatures falling apart or fiddling with it. So that was my option. But if you want to get that armory pack, you can do that as well and swap out some of the weapons. The miniature size, though, is different. These miniatures are about 45 millimeter, which is, I think, significantly larger than your standard miniature. Now, that's a pro because they are beautiful miniatures with a lot of detail, and they have just a table presence, which is awesome. On the other hand, it's a con because you can't really use these miniatures for other games because they're so large. With KDM, if I chose to, I could use those miniatures or even swap in and proxy miniatures that I have from my extensive D&D collection or other miniature heavy games. But in this case, this scale is so different and so much larger than any other game that really I can only use it for Oathsworn. Now, one of the biggest pros for me regarding Oathsworn is there's much more narration and story to the game. So I'm a person who really loves narration and story behind a game. I know other people aren't as motivated by that, but one of my favorite games is Madara, which previous to Oathsworn had some of the most intriguing and best storylines. Now, one of the things that happens with storylines is oftentimes you are railroaded into one path because it's really hard to have a lot of branching narrative. But I'm happy to say with Oathsworn, there is a ton of branching paths during the story phase, and I think that makes it so that replayability is a good option. I'm definitely going to be playing through this more than once just because I'm so intrigued by the different choices that a person can make and how it impacts the rest of the gameplay as well as flow of the narration. Kingdom Death Monster doesn't have explicit stories being told, although I would say it is very intriguing where you're creating your own narration by the choices and decisions that you're making. So your own imagination does tend to fill in the story of your survivors camp and what's going on there. You're not as tied to any individual survivor because they're just going to die. So you don't have that emotional attachment to any character. In this game, you sort of more traditionally do keep your heroes and are able to have a story sort of built up, not so much about them, but around them. That's one of the differences that I really like, both about KDM, where because the world is so unique, there is a story that sort of builds up inside of yourself as you're going along. Whereas with Oathsworn, you do have a more overt and outlined story. And one of the awesome things is you can use an app for the story mode where you have excellent narration voice acting by James Cosmo, who was an actor in Game of Thrones. So that is top tier voice acting that's done for the app. Secondly, probably the biggest difference between Oathsworn and KDM is that Oathsworn is an easier game. So our game group has played through 4 different campaigns with KDM, and we have yet to succeed in finishing out successfully the game because our survivor camp gets wiped out, and oftentimes it's brutal. It's through bad luck in your dice roll, and in KDM there is single roll deaths that can happen where there's no dice mitigation when that happens. And so with KDM, I have gotten depressed after playing a game because of how much things aren't in your control, and just fate has it so that you are wiped out by bad luck. So KDM is a much more brutal game. It's a darker game, and I get depressed playing that game because bad dice rolls can totally hose you and can shut down your entire camp where you lose. Oathsworn is not like that. Oathsworn is a much easier game because of a couple of reasons. One, you can adjust the difficulty level. There are 5 different difficulty levels that you can adjust the game to fit sort of what you want to get out of the game. Now, I do think that at least in the default difficulty mode, that the game is fairly challenging. The boss battles are fairly challenging, and it has come down to the last couple of rolls determining whether or not we succeed or fail at beating the boss. So I feel like the gameplay is pretty tense. It isn't necessarily easy, where you have to be fairly strategic in order to win the boss battles. There is a lot more different ways to mitigate bad luck. When you're drawing for damage, you have 2 options in Oathsworn. One is rolling your dice, or you can choose to use cards instead, where it shows you the amount of damage that you do. Now, the reason why you might choose cards over using the dice is because you can count the cards because you know the number of misses that you have in each deck. So based off of how many misses you've already drawn, you can sort of try to guess, or you can calculate the chances of how successful you are. And it's a little bit push your luck mechanic where you can choose a number of cards that you're drawing. And you can determine some of that based off of the chance of drawing 2 blank cards. So that's one way that you can mitigate some of the randomness of dice rolls. Or you can choose to just do dice rolls and take your chances with that, because it tends to be a little bit more swingy in the sense that you can get really high numbers or really low numbers with the dice. Whereas with the cards, you are able to card count and therefore have a little bit more control over what your results are going to be. Secondly, you're getting a lot of combat tokens that enable you to reroll, that enable you to upgrade your dice, that enable you to shield yourself. So you are able to, in many more ways, mitigate some of that bad luck, where you're not having the swinginess, and when you have a night of bad dice rolling, that it doesn't completely hose you. And in Oathsworn, when you do miss an attack, you can choose to receive one of the combat tokens, one of the bonuses. So missing isn't completely bad. You actually get something out of it that you can use for your next attack. Also, there isn't permadeath in this game, where if your hero goes down to 0 hit points, they are just knocked out and you're able to use them again for the next turn or next battles. Also, when you're knocked out, you can bring in an ally so that if you're having 4 people around the table, you're not just sitting there waiting for the encounter to be over because you got knocked out. You actually play the ally, which is a weaker form of the heroes, and that keeps you engaged in the game. Also, when you fail to defeat a monster, you can move on. The narration does handle defeats, but you're encouraged to actually replay the boss scenario until you succeed in killing it. That isn't an option in Kingdom Death Monster. You can have a party wipe, or you can flee one of the boss battles with a lot of bad things that happen as a result. But in this game, I think the times that I'm going to fail the boss battle, I'll just go ahead and replay it again until I succeed. So that's an option in Oathsworn. In terms of complexity of rules, you have a lot more tactical decisions of what you're going to do, as well as who goes when, as each player doesn't do all of their actions at once before the next player goes. You can switch it up where I just move with one hero and then the other person attacks, and then I can go back to that first hero to do more actions. So there's complexity, I would say more complexity in terms of how the actual battle goes, or more tactical decisions, but I enjoy that. For some of you, you might want a simpler battle rule set, and you would find that in Kingdom Death Monster only slightly. Now, both of them, I would say, have excellent AI decks with a ton of surprises and a ton of different variability in terms of what each of the bosses do. But if you want a slightly simpler battle rule set, KDM is the way to go, as this is a little bit more complex. Now, I love tabletop wargaming, and because of that, I like the additional tactical decisions that you're making with Oathsworn, but for some of you, that might be a turnoff. Also in Oathsworn, different is that you are managing cards. So some people say that it's similar to Gloomhaven, where you're using cards. I think it's a super different game than Gloomhaven, but it is true that you are trying to figure out which abilities that you want to use, which ones are available. There's a cooldown mechanic where that card is unavailable until it comes back into your hand, and that's completely different from KDM. So again, more complexity, but more options with what your heroes can do. Also, your actions are limited by these animus tokens, so you need to be managing that as a resource as it determines what kind of actions you can take. So there might be turns where you don't do as many actions so that you can get all of your action points back to be able to do a lot the next turn. Another difference is that in Kingdom Death Monster, at least in the base box, you're getting a handful of bosses that you can fight. I've never found it to be the case where there isn't enough bosses in KDM, as you can go back and fight the same boss over and over again. Oathsworn comes with about 20 different bosses, and each one of those bosses you're only fighting once. So it isn't the case where you have the choice to go back to fight the same boss over and over again to get the rewards for that boss. Now, the bonus of that is that you have a ton of variability where you're not entirely sure what the AI is or how this boss has different mechanics. So you're just learning a ton about each one of the boss monsters that come out on the board. With KDM, eventually, because you're fighting the same bosses over and over again, you do learn their AI deck, you do learn their style. Now, they do scale up in difficulty, but for the most part, you do learn their deck, and so you gain an expertise in how to fight certain monsters and what kinds of things you need to bring into the game. With Oathsworn, oftentimes you're going into the battle really not knowing too much about the AI, so you need to learn a whole different enemy and the tactics that you need in order to succeed there. Whether or not that amount of variability is a pro or con for you is up to you to decide. For me, I actually like both styles. The other downside might be the fact that because there are 20 different bosses that are all hidden, you're getting 2 giant boxes in addition to this huge regular base box. And again, if storage is an issue, that might be difficult to know what to do with those 2 big boxes. It is a hidden mechanic. Until you are instructed through the narration to open up which box, you do not know which boss monster you're going to be fighting. Now for me, as someone who hates playing with unpainted miniatures, I'm actually in the process of opening up the next couple of bosses and painting them. So I'm going to have them already painted, and so what they look like at least isn't going to be a surprise for me. I don't care, or I don't mind, because I have no idea what their mechanics are. But you do have a ton of mystery content, so if that's something that you really enjoy, you're going to like that in Oathsworn. Now, because there is a lot more to do with each of the companions or the heroes, I really love the fact that Oathsworn provides a companion version, which is a simplified version of each one of these heroes that you can play. So that makes playing this game solo viable. Otherwise, I think managing the hands of 4 characters would be really difficult and really hard. It would be similar to managing 4 heroes in Gloomhaven, which I've never attempted to do. I think managing 2 heroes is fairly difficult in Gloomhaven. In this game, you do have to play with all 4 heroes, regardless of the player count. And the simplified play of the companions makes this game soloable. And you can determine or decide, hey, I'm going to play a full set of 1 hero, and then have companion cards for the other 3, or, you know, if you're playing with kids, they can play the companion card. I mean, theoretically, all 4 of you can be playing with the companion card version, the simplified version, which would make gameplay fairly simple. And I found, actually, that the companion version isn't a significantly weaker version of this one. Now, I think it's a lot more fun to play the full version, but that is one option if you feel like the full version is too complex for you, or for maybe your children if they wanted to play as well. I have found Kingdom Death Monster soloable, because there you do have to play with 4 heroes minimum, since the combat is simpler. So if you're intending to solo the game, I think both KDM and Oathsworn is viable for you. I will say Kingdom Death Monster can accommodate more than 4 players, so our game group, there's 6 of us, although we've never played with all 6. The most we've played with is 5, because there are rules to make each of the bosses harder by giving more hit points. And Oathsworn doesn't have rules for more than 4 heroes, so that is a con for Oathsworn. Also, Kingdom Death Monster has anywhere between 24 to 26 different lantern years or sessions, where you have the story mode and then the encounter mode, which is a little bit more than the Oathsworn game that has approximately 20 different bosses or cycles through the story mode and the encounter mode. So what is my conclusion? Is Oathsworn my KDM killer? So at this point early on in playing Oathsworn, I haven't played a ton of the scenarios, but early on I will say no, it is not a KDM killer, because the 2 games feel different enough where I think they're giving you enough of a different experience that both of them are good on your gaming shelf. Because sometimes, honestly, I do want to play a brutally hard game, similar to Dark Souls. Some people really like playing Dark Souls because of that challenge. When you win in KDM, it really feels like an accomplishment. Some of you really don't like that level of difficulty or brutality in your games, so you will be turned off by KDM. But our game group really does like the challenge of that, and even the bad luck that you can have and the emotional roller coaster ride that KDM provides. It is really distinct and unique. But Oathsworn right now, I really, really recommend and like a lot, because of the better narration that's in it, because the battle, you have much more mitigation of bad luck, as well as the tactical nature of the boss battles, which I really enjoy as well, the more choices that you have with your heroes. I really, really like this game a lot. So I am keeping KDM in my collection. Oathsworn definitely is a game that I'm going to go through the entire campaign multiple times. I think it is that good. So definitely receives the Gaming Geek stamp of approval. I'm so glad that they are having a second Kickstarter, so that if you missed out on the first one, jump in this October 18th. And if I were to guess, next month's $100 towards a crowdfunder most likely will be for that Oathsworn campaign. So use my link below to go to my Patreon page to get in on that, as well as other giveaways. Please like and subscribe. Otherwise, stay tuned as I share a little bit about the various 3D prints, in addition to a quick demo of the undercoating that I did for the miniatures. Happy gaming. We'll see you next time. All right, so the first thing is I did create these 3D printed card boxes to replace the cardboard ones, because the cardboard ones were extra wide and not deep enough. So I did 3D print these. Links for all of these are going to be in the descriptions below. This is one that I did custom make, so it'll be in the Google Drive if you wanted to grab that. So 4 of them do fit in. I did create a 5th one because there wasn't one. I didn't want to put all of the hero cards into their Ziploc bags, but wanted it available like this in a card holder. These next couple of things I did pull off of Thingiverse. This is a hero card tray. I did modify it where I cut out this base, because just to save on print time and PLA, you don't really need it. And what it enables you to do is, normally you set down your cards like this and it follows around the perimeter of your dashboard. But this way you can just save some table space by sticking it in these slots, and it's going through the 4 different phases of cooldown. And then here I have a deck holder for your attack cards. 2 of them, one for the enemy and one for the heroes. Again, this was pulled off of Thingiverse. I did have to modify it because it actually wasn't high enough. The card sleeves that I'm using for this is a little bit thicker, so the original that was on Thingiverse wasn't deep enough, so I modified it. I also put these slots here so that you could pick up the cards as the discard pile more readily. And then this fits right over like so that you can store it away easily. Let's go ahead and move on to terrain. This was pulled off of Thingiverse as well, and then scaled a little bit larger to be the stumps. I did see a number of playthroughs where people did buy the 3D terrain pack, and the trees were really tall, and it looked like it was getting in the way of gameplay. So instead of, I have a ton of trees, but instead of the trees, I went ahead and just followed the design here and created stumps, just because it makes it a little bit easier and less in the way for gameplay. This is pretty standard for a wall. Not very hard. And then the house, this is actually from Printable Scenery. Check out my video here when they were having a Kickstarter for the Hagglethorn Hollow miniatures. I like the Ruin version just because any house out in the deep woods probably wouldn't be inhabited. I have a ton of other houses, fantasy houses, like this one over here. This could work really well too. But again, I think I like this one. It's a little bit less in the way, and it just sits right on top of the template. So I start off by base coating everything with Rattle Can Black, and I use 2x Ultra Cover for that. And now I just use a worn out dry brush to put on Craft Paint White. You can use miniature paints if you want. Now, I've done a whole video about how to do this undercoating, and this is fast forwarded right here. And if you want to check out that video in comparison to airbrushing, Zenithal highlighting, or using a rattle can, go ahead and click here. But I decided to do this style because of the grim dark nature of this setting. And here is an example of the exile as well. I wish I would have done a little bit brighter white, a second coat of white around the face and some of the skin for the exile, because it turned out a little bit darker than I wanted. But here's the base as well. So everything is just layered, dry coated with white as the bottom layer. And I use my contrast colors to do sort of my normal paints with all of these miniatures. So again, check out many of my other painting tutorials on how I use contrast colors for speed painting. I'm not entirely sure whether or not this was much faster than if I had done traditional painting, but it definitely does have the dark fantasy effect that I want. That's much more muted, not so bright. and the paint goes on relatively easily. Here I'm putting on some silver. There's a lot of silver for the metal parts, the armor, the buckles, the swords, and other weapons. So I'm using a lot of silver, and then sometimes I go over it with some Nuln oil just to darken it up a little bit. But here is an example of where I actually did make it brighter with more white, and this is some of the result. So I think I do like making the face especially a little bit brighter, because I feel like in the other two miniatures the face was a little bit too dull. And this is what it looks like for this character here. I think the bases turned out really well too. I like how it has sculpted bases using the same method of the brush on Zenithal base coat, which gives this kind of effect. Here's a comparison with one of GW's Warcry miniatures, where I just did a white undercoating. There was no Zenithal at all. And you can see some of the differences here of the brightness if you don't do any Zenithal and you just go straight onto white. That's definitely an option, and I know a number of other people who have taken pictures or a video of their gameplay. They've done a straight on contrast colors on top of white. So you can definitely do that. But again, I was going more for a dark fantasy look. And with my rat Broodmother, I went ahead and did a more traditional paint. I actually spray painted, primed this all gray, and then put on craft paint over it. And this is going to be before I dip it. So the dip method that I use here is also shown in this video, a zombicide of how I use basically wood stain in order to create shading. So check that out if you want. But I think it looks really good, especially by dirtying it up with the shade. You can use paint shades if you want, but this is much more economical. Here are some of the rats minions, and I think it turned out well.